Good morning and welcome to the webinar on compliance and risk support. My name is Michelle and I'll be your webinar moderator today. Today you'll be hearing from Justin Prince, Managing Director at LevelUp. Justin will talk about wages, benchmarking, electronic voting, policies and training for your business. Like always, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question, please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll be answering the questions at the end of the session. So welcome, Justin, and over to you.
So good morning and nice to meet you all. Appreciate you taking the time to come along. So we'll keep this as short and painless as humanly possible, albeit talking about fun things like human resources and industrial relations legislation and compliance. So apologies if it's a little bit dry, but I'll try and make it a bit of fun. So today what we're going to do is cover off on what's changed in the legislation over the last 12 months since the Labor government took power of the federal government, and how specifically does this affect you. We'll talk about the key actions that you need to take to protect your business, a little bit about us, our approach and our solutions, and what our role in supporting NatRoad members actually is. So the first thing to note is that everything we're going to talk about is very much approached from a risk perspective. Different organizations have different risk profiles, and what I'm not recommending is that everybody do everything. You need to have a look at your organization and understand what exposures you have, and as a result of those exposures, what actions you feel are most appropriate to take based on how those actions actually affect your business. So for some organizations, they'll take more significant action based on the level of risk they're exposed to. Others will take smaller levels of action. So what's changed and how does this impact you? So I've pulled out some of the key changes that I think are directly applicable to NatRoad members across the board. So all of these issues are things that you're going to face and are things that you are likely going to want to do something about. We've given you some recommended actions. Again, it's based on where you think your risk profile is. The first element there is the change in legislation around pay secrecy. Now, I'm not sure who I've got online and what exposure you've got to contracts of employment, but one of the common clauses in the vast majority of contracts has been a requirement for confidentiality, particularly when it comes to pay and conditions. This is something that the government has now decided is an unlawful term. Now, there's a couple of things to realize here that as of June this year, it'll actually be a civil offence to have these terms in your contracts. And that means your enterprise agreements or your common law contracts. Your employees will have a lawful right to disclose what their pay and conditions are to any other person. So that means anybody inside your business, anybody outside your business. It can be the union, it can be anyone. So this idea of being able to keep whatever it is that you're doing for an individual between you and the individual is now largely gone. The reason the government's put this in place is under the blanket of gender equity and making sure that everybody understands where the other people are so that people can be better at making sure that they look after themselves. The action here around fixing this or making sure that you protect yourself from this is to update all of your employment contract templates pretty much straight away. And the simplest thing to do is just to delete that clause if you have it out of your contracts. The other thing that you're going to have to do, while the term itself becomes what we call severable once the law changes, the best course of action is really for you to issue a change of conditions letter to all of your current employees, voiding that clause, or better yet, issuing them an entirely new letter of offer with that clause removed. Now, obviously, that process opens you up to questions. Why are you doing this? And potentially there's the opportunity for individuals to seek to negotiate better terms at that particular point. But the bottom line is that you're going to have to communicate at some level around this change and the strategy that you're going to use to make sure that you're compliant. Now, you need to realize that if you don't do anything about this, you are open to civil penalties and fines from the government. So this is not something that you want to sit on. It is something that you should act on. The next big change is really this multi-entity bargaining stuff that's been going on. Now, what this means is that for any of you, you can't see me on a camera, but if you have grey hair like me, you'll remember the good old days where unions were able to bargain collectively with multiple employers simultaneously. They were called multi-entity agreements, and create a consistent set of terms across almost an industry. And they would do this by approaching the largest of the employers and getting them on side. And what that meant is that the smaller employers would have to then follow suit, because the union and that agreement would then be representative of what the commission at the time would call an industry. So we're going back to those days now, which means that unions can initiate bargaining at any point for these multi-entity agreements, as long as those organisations they're seeking to bargain with don't have a current valid EBA in place. Yes, and as long as they have a majority, what's considered to be a majority of the industry wrapped up in this bargaining. If you are a smaller organization, and I mean an organization that employs, let's say, anywhere between 20 and sort of 40 people, you run the risk here of being forced to adopt a set of terms and conditions that are actually being agreed with other larger organizations that are more consistent with how they operate rather than how you operate. Obviously, the problems here is that your cost base for your employment could change pretty significantly to be more, to be higher, I guess, because a lot of the larger organizations have different terms in there that are probably more beneficial than perhaps some of the terms that you have. So if you have an expired EBA, or you do not have an EBA in place right now, the best protection for you for this is to actually get there and get your own EBA in place now. You can't be wrapped up in anything like this if you have a current enterprise agreement in place. Now, after those two things, are there any questions out there at the moment for those two elements? I'll take that as a no. Right, the next two changes. Zombie agreements. Could I just ask a question of the group? Does anybody have any employee agreements that were created prior to 2010 as part of work choices that are still floating around? Just get an indication of a yes or a no would be good.
They can raise their hand and I can count those.
So let's go with yeses. Is there any yeses in the room? Is that?
Doesn't look like it.
No, okay, so nobody's got any zombie agreements. All right, I won't spend too much time on this then, but essentially what happened is organizations created EAs under work choices and never replaced them, just left them alone. So they expired and they just continued to operate. And there's obviously a difference between an EBA that's expired and is still operating and an EBA that's been terminated. So what will happen is the government will just terminate all of these EBAs, and employers will then revert back to the award, or if there's an industry EBA in place, as in multi-union agreements, they'll revert to that agreement. So again, the recommendation is here to terminate that agreement yourself and actually put your own EBA in place. The next fairly significant change has really got to do with sexual harassment, and this idea that historically, as an employer, our job was to reduce the risk of people being affected by this issue in the business, as best as we could. So it was very much a health and safety type of approach. So eliminate and use the hierarchy of controls to try and remove the risk. However, there was no positive duty of care, which meant we didn't have to take preventative actions. We just had to take reasonable action. And there's a big difference between a positive duty of care and just a duty of care. So the positive duty of care means that everybody now has to demonstrate that they have taken proactive steps to prevent sexual harassment, discrimination, and other workplace behaviour-based issues that are related to the work health and safety legislation around risk. So this is a pretty important difference. So the recommendations that we have here for you guys is you need to get in and have a look at your current policy. If you have one, if you don't have one, you need one. And you need to look at your current practices around how you respond to and manage these issues, as well as the training that you get and the communication that you have with your employees around um, what the expectations of them are as employees, number one, but also around how you expect them to react and communicate should one of these issues occur. This is pretty important. It's very because this falls under the Work Health and Safety Act, there are some fairly significant penalties from a civil point of view should people make complaints and you be found to be in breach of your responsibilities. There's also what we call a reverse onus of proof on some of the claims, particularly under grievance, adverse action grievances, where you as the employer need to prove that you actually have been doing the right thing. It's not up to the complainant to try and prove their case. This is a very difficult thing to do, and the vast majority of adverse action claims are lost by employers because of this difficulty. So this one particularly is important. The risks here are civil penalties, there are fines under the Work Health and Safety Act, and there's also stop harassment orders that are now available to employees through the Commission, similar to the stop bullying orders that we had before. The best policy here, guys, is avoidance. If you get caught up in these things, it is very unpleasant. This is me speaking as a professional who's been doing these things for longer than I care to admit, and getting involved in having to do investigations and deal and try and unwind some of these problems. Avoidance really is the best course of action, and having a very, very clear and robust process around managing these things, protecting yourself and the impacted employees, both sides, it's critical. Any questions on those two? So how are we doing questions, Michelle? Are we just, is it?
Yeah, I have two questions. Do you want to get them now, or do you want them at the end?
Yep. No, we can go now.
Sure. The first one is, what does the wage benchmarking process involve and how long does it take?
Okay. All right, so it's not quite in line with what we've got here, but
Yeah.
I'll answer it fairly quickly. So there's several steps in the wage benchmarking process. And it really depends on you as an employer and how deep into the data you want to go. We can look at the first step is looking at you internally and making sure that you've achieved what we call pay parity. So obviously there's a change in legislation around making sure you have equal pay across like roles. So that's step one. Step two is then looking at current state market information, and that can come from your job boards like Seek, Indeed, Adzuno, Facebook, where we look at adverts that are being published and we look at the rates or the ranges of rates that are being published along with those things. LinkedIn as well, we use that as a data source. We then look at other organizations and competitors and their enterprise agreements, what rates they've been publishing there. Depending on you as an organization, there's sometimes access to industry data through salary surveys that we look at as well. Typically that's paid for though, and that's something that you would need to consider as to whether or not it's worthwhile. Typically we get most of the data that we need from the first couple of steps. The process is a bit manual because it means we have to log in and look at all these things and literally count. We then produce a report at the other end of that, which shows you what we found against those organizations in those particular locations, what the approximate ranges are of salaries or wages in those areas, and we try and compare that to where you're at to give you an idea of what the delta looks like.
Great. I do have another one.
Sure.
If we as a company do nothing about the new Respect at Work recommendations,
Mhm.
will we be breaking the law? And what is the worst that can happen?
Okay, so under the Work Health and Safety Act, if you fail to take action, your directors can be fined, as can the company. So you've got to remember that with the WHS Act, all of this legislation falls under there. And it can be quite vicious. I think the last one I saw was the director was fined something like $200,000 and the company was fined over $1 million for failing to take appropriate action. And that was case law around this sort of sexual harassment um, about a month or so ago. So it's not small, it's very significant. Um, you won't be, strictly speaking, you will be breaking the law, yes, because the law states you have a positive duty of care to take action. However, the risk here is around complaint. So you only really get exposed should someone complain. I would say this, we've seen a huge uptick in complaints in this space over the last 12 months as a result of the focus that has been placed on it by the government, by the mining sector, by the media, and the days of employees just accepting that it is the way it is are gone. I'd also point out that, and again, here's a bit of education around these things. When you look at the definition of what is sexual harassment or harassment, um, it comes down to the view of the person that's been impacted and what they feel has occurred. The intent of the protagonist doesn't actually matter. So you end up having complaints about behaviors that are not actually, when you get to the bottom of it, are not significant behaviors and could have been solved should the employees just have spoken to each other. But because the complainant becomes so upset about something in particular and feels they have a right to complain, you end up with an investigation, you end up with broken relationships, and you end up with some pretty negative outcomes. Um, a good example is one I dealt with recently, where an employee felt that another employee was bullying them by glaring at them. So there's a good example. So does that answer the question there, guys?
Thank you. Yeah, no more questions for now.
Okay, cool. All right, so there's some pretty good stuff in there, and from the Respect at Work changes, again, depending on your business, your exposure, and how you work, you don't have to do all of these things. The more risk you're exposed to, the more of them you'll need to do. It just depends, and we need to look at you and see what's going to be best for you. The objective here is to implement strategies that are not going to, dramatically negatively impact your bottom line or your business processes. We try and reduce the risk. You have flexible work arrangements. And again, I don't know who here has been exposed to these in the past, but in the past, again, it was quite very few flexible workplace arrangement requests have actually been made in the past. Um, uh, these things are, again, increasing because of these changes in policy. And basically it means that you have a greater responsibility as an employer to prove that you have considered, consulted, and made an appropriate decision in this space. Whereas historically, if somebody had asked, you could basically just write back and say, no, it's not going to work. And that was the end of it. Complaints in this space are open to, again, the Fair Work arbitration process and grievances, and again, are usually tied up with things like discrimination or harassment claims should you fail to manage them properly. So the big thing here is, again, just update your policy and do training for your managers who are likely to receive these requests to make sure that they don't just dismiss them out of hand for any reason, that there's a process behind it and you can actually manage it. The last one here, I think, which is the big one that I thought would be worth you guys talking about, are fixed term contracts. Could I get indication of anybody in the room who has people employed under fixed term contracts at the moment?
We just get a show of hands from anyone. one, this one.
Okay. So look, the reason that most organizations used fixed term contracts is so that at the end of the contracted term, you were able to let the employee go without being exposed to things like redundancy costs and severance. That's the primary reason people use these things. There's also this idea that you could continue to then renew and negotiate the terms around this fixed term contract every time it came up for expiry. So there's a lot of organizations out there that have just gone on year to year and rolled people on. Um, so that will no longer be a lawful element. You will no longer legally be able to do that. Um, and there will actually be civil penalties in place for organizations who have that practice in place. Um, so basically, it means that if you do have people floating around in these fixed term contracts, there needs to be, number one, a reason for it. For the first 2 years, once you get to the end of the 2 years, you have two choices. You either need to off-hire the employee or convert them to being a permanent hire, whether that be full-time or part-time. So is there any questions on the fixed term contract stuff?
No.
No? Okay. So those are kind of what I feel are the major changes that are impactful for NatRoads members. Look, there's a lot of other things that are happening aside of the legislation, and there's a lot more to come this year. These are the ones, though, that I felt you should sit up and pay attention to straight away. As part of how we work, we come and talk to you. We figure out what your business looks like, how you operate, and what you're exposed to, and then we try and help you understand the key actions you need to take in the short term to sort of mitigate some of your risk in that space. And again, it's all about risk and reward. You don't want to spend a whole heap of money mitigating your risk down to zero if the risk to begin with was marginal. So we focus in on the things that really could impact you badly, and we try and fix those in the first instance. So who are we? So we're actually a business improvement consultancy, and you can kind of see a little triangle there on the left-hand side. That's actually our model, our way of thinking and working. Um, our key focus is really about people, processes, and technology, and how those three elements help you be more efficient and scalable in the work that you do. Each of our business functions covers things like how you win work, how you execute work, and the technology that you use to make sure that you have efficiency. So that's kind of us. We work on two different ways. We can offer just general straight consulting, where you give us a fixed task, we figure out what needs to happen, we price it, we do it, we leave. And we're not a normal consulting firm where we just generate a report and say, here you go, that's up to you to go and do. We physically sit there and do the work with you, because we recognize that a lot of the time what's missing from this is not necessarily the knowledge, it's the know-how to actually get it done and the resources to make it work. The other way that we work is through what we call our in-source solutions, where organizations come to us and say, we need a resource, we need process and potentially technology to work in a particular area. Let's say it's safety or human resources, or it could be commercial, whatever. We then provide the resource, the supporting technology, and all the processes for that role, and we have a person that does that job for you for a period of time. And that could be based around helping you to build what you need internally. And then once you've built everything you need, we then help you recruit the right person into the role and we leave again. Our objective is not to be there forever for our clients. Our objective is to come in, get what needs to be done, and then get out. So two of us, that's me. I won't spend too much time talking about me. I started LevelUp about 5 years ago now, and we're a team of about 30 employees across pre-contracts, post-award commercial work, estimating engineering, technology, human resources, and industrial relations. Angelina Allen, who's my business partner, is the commercial side of the business. She looks after our pre-contracts and commercial services, supply chain, risk management, all that kind of good fun stuff. There's two of us in the business. Our role with NatRoad. So there's two critical functions. The first is the employee and human resources functional support. So we look at your EBAs, helping you to get your EB in place, facilitated bargaining and handling all the submissions that you need to make with the commission. And again, we draw the line based on where you need us to start and stop. So if you just need us to do one portion, that's all we do, or we can scale up to do all of it if that's what you want. We look at all your contracts and letters of offer, policy procedure, and making sure that you have the right stuff in place, and that includes doing a bit of a gap analysis. We'll do the training piece. So this is about helping to either take off the shelf training that we've already got in place and customize it for you, or build your own training if we need to, and facilitate it for you so we can get everybody up to scratch, as well as looking at technology selection, deployment, and configuration. So that's kind of the HR component of things. On the commercial services of stuff, we look at risk analysis and business continuity. So this is now the impact of making the changes that you're planning on making on your commercial viability. So if you're going to increase your labor costs by 10% or 15% or something like that, what does that do to your baseline business cost and revenue, your profitability, and the contracts that you're actually running with your clients, and other actions that you can take in that space to claw back some of any potential losses through increases that you're going to see through your current current relationships and contracts with clients. We do the labour market rate assessments and cost analysis. This is again the stuff we talked about earlier. I realised I didn't answer the last part of that question, which is how long does this take? Look, again, the answer is it depends. Around 4 weeks of elapsed time is what you should allow for us to actually get the work done. It just depends on how many competitors we're looking at, how many roles we're looking at across how many locations in Australia. And obviously, the more we look at, the more data we're gathering, and the longer it takes, the less we're looking at in a narrower space. The less data, the less time it takes. The last piece we look at there is contract analysis and revision. So this is both, this is supplier and client contracts that you might hold to see what we can do, if anything, as I said before, to help you recover some of the costs associated with the impact of these changes. So that's us.
Great. I do have 2 more questions.
Great, go ahead.
The first one is, how does fixed term contracts impact subcontractors or third-party businesses engaged to perform a task?
Okay, fixed term contracts are associated with employees, not subcontractors. Okay, so these are people who are employees. That means you pay them superannuation, you pay their tax for them, they accrue some level of leave liabilities, things like that. So there's no interaction between the fixed term contracts we're talking about and subcontractors. Now, just a word of warning for those of you out there thinking, oh, we'll just make all of our subbies or all of our fixed term contractors subcontractors. There is regulations under a thing called sham contracting. Sham contracting is an ATO-based problem, and it's all about the attempted tax dodge that a lot of organisations have when they try and turn individuals into companies and then contract them back as contractors. And there's a number of tests in that space to confirm whether or not somebody is actually an employee or a subcontractor. The primary one is what's called the control test, and it basically looks at, number one, how much revenue does that subcontractor generate from your business compared to other clients. So if you are their sole source of revenue, then the argument that the ATO will have is that they're actually an employee, not a subcontractor. So they need at least 2 other sources of revenue in that space to be able to demonstrate that they're actually a subby. And I know that there's quite a large number of people who operate as sole traders who get caught up in that kind of thing for subcontractors. There's a few other control things in there, but that's the primary one.
Right, thank you. And the other question is, we heard from ABLA last week that they can assist NATRAD members with making an enterprise agreement. We employ 41 employees. Is it a legal requirement or simply recommended to have one? Please explain how LevelUp can assist with this process and what is the steps involved.
Sure. So no, it is not a legal requirement. Okay, so quick IR structure 101 lesson. All of our employment legislation is fundamentally built on a concept that we want to drive our employees to a place where they are collectively bargaining with their employer to generate terms and conditions that are more beneficial to them than what is provided at law. So what you have is you have a number of pieces of legislation. Fundamentally, the first one is the National Employment Standards and the Fair Work Act. That provides your minimum terms of reference when it comes to employees. Layered over the top of that, so as the next step up, is the award. Now, awards are law, so you cannot pay less than what is in an award. What the award and the legislation provides for is this right to collectively bargain, to create an enterprise agreement that provides for terms and conditions that are better than what's provided by the award and the NES. So you don't need an EBA, but your employees have got the right to initiate bargaining with you to achieve that. And all the legislation is there to support them to do that. So no, it is not law to have an EBA. We do recommend it, and we go back to that initial comment I made around the multi-entity bargaining process. What is going to happen is unions will start to seek out significant employers inside of an industry and attempt to demonstrate that they represent more than half of the industry and its interests. And if they then bargain and implement an EBA and you don't have one, you will just become automatically a signatory to that EBA, and you'll fall under the rates, terms and conditions that have been negotiated for you. So it's a case of get on the front foot rather than being caught out on the back foot. But theoretically, yeah, you could do nothing and sit still. It's not a problem.
Great. Well, we don't have, oh, I think there's one more. Just a moment, sorry.
No problems.
Here we go. Yes, one more came in. Finding truck drivers is a big problem for the whole industry. How can LevelUp assist us with finding and employing drivers? What services do you offer and how does it work?
All right, well, a couple of quick things here. I just realized I didn't talk about what we do around the EBAs. So let me just recap on that really quickly. So our services are hands-on practical services. So we would take the EBA that's been designed by ABLA, we would refine it so it reflected your specific business. So that means if you wanted a classification structure in that EBA was specific to you, we'd do that. If there was any particular allowances or terms that you wanted to provide for, we'd update those things. We then would assist you in communicating and bargaining directly with your employees. So that's commencing bargaining and all the documentation associated with that, helping you with comms strategies and or physically communicating on your behalf if needed. Managing things like the access period and all the documentation around getting your employees to a place where they're good to vote, facilitating the vote, and also doing the Form 16, 17 submissions at the end to get your EBA approved. So that's kind of where we sit. We are not lawyers, so if something jumps up where we do need legal advice, we would go to ABLA to seek that, but we are very good at what we do and we typically don't need lawyers unless something really goes badly. So that's kind of where we fit in. The recruitment question, we are not really recruiters, okay? We can do elements of recruitment if needed. So for example, I have a number of people who work for me who work in the recruitment space and are working across multiple clients to recruit on their behalf. So if you wanted us to do that for you, you could contact us and we could provide a resource and the technology to help you recruit. And then you would pay almost like a labor hire type rate for that person and the tech for them to work with you to get the result. We kind of prefer to work that way because we don't think that placement fees are really conducive to our clients getting the best people, number one. If you don't want to work that way, yeah, sure, we can offer you some support when it comes to permanent placements for a fee. I think our baseline fee is 10% or something like that. But again, we don't do a hell of a lot of that because we're not actually recruiters, although we have the skill set to do it. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you very much. Well, we don't have any other questions, so that will conclude the session. So thank you, Justin, for presenting today. And thank you everyone for attending the webinar. If you have any questions, please send it to info@natro.com.au and we can pass it on to Justin. Today's webinar will be uploaded to the Workplace Relations website as well. So thanks again for attending.
Thank you, everyone, and good luck.